Hi, we're going to talk about research design, and we're going to do that using examples from positive psychology. So in this video, we'll introduce some of the basics: theories and hypotheses, variables and operational definitions, populations and samples. In the next videos, we'll talk about experimental research and non-experimental research. So what I'm going to have you do is think through a few of the questions that a researcher would have to think through if they were designing a study. So suppose you're interested in studying happiness. Happiness is too big and broad and vague. What does that even mean? So one of the first things you would have to do is narrow down your focus. So that is the first reflection I have for you here. Take a moment and think about what are some factors you think might cause or relate to happiness. In other words, what are some ideas you could test related to happiness? Pause, think a little bit, and then press play when you're ready to begin again. Okay, you probably had a bunch of ideas. They may have ranged from health to success at work, to good relationships, to money, to hobbies, to pets, to food, whatever. But the idea is that you have a list. There's lots of different ways to narrow down the focus when looking at happiness. And that leads us to looking at theories and hypotheses. A theory is a broad idea, and it does two things. One is it explains observations that have already been made. But two, it also allows you to make predictions about observations that have not yet been made. Okay? A hypothesis is a specific prediction. It is empirically testable. So it is specific, it is testable, and it is in the form of a statement. And it is derived from a theory. So if you look at this chart here, you can see how observations lead to forming a theory to explain those observations, and then from that theory, you can generate some specific testable hypotheses. So here's an example. Suppose that you believe that happiness levels are genetic. You inherit them from your parents. Well, consistent with your general idea, you specifically suspect that identical twins will have measured happiness levels that are more similar than fraternal twins, since identical twins share 100% of their genes. They're genetic clones. In other words, if you believe that happiness is genetic, then people who have the same genes should also have the same levels of happiness. Okay? Also consistent with your general idea, you specifically suspect that happiness levels will be difficult or impossible to change through purposeful activities like counting your blessings or doing random acts of kindness or doing meditation or any other intentional activity. Because again, if you believe that happiness is genetic, then it should be really difficult to change through any particular activity. So when you look at these 3 bullet points, which one do you think is a theory? It's the first one. The first one is broad. It's general. You can't directly test it. So the next 2 bullet points are specific hypotheses that can be tested. You can get a group of twins. You can measure their happiness levels and then get data. Or you can have a group of people and then train them to do a particular activity and then measure their happiness levels. Those are testable. And you'll either support or not support your hypothesis, and then in turn support or not support your theory. Okay? Here's another reflection. What are some ways that happiness could be observed or measured in the laboratory? In other words, what are some external and/or internal signs of happiness? So, pause the video, take a moment to reflect, and then press play when you're ready. Okay, you probably had some different ideas. Some of those ideas may be physiological, like heart rate or breathing rate, or maybe even brain activity. Those are physiological forms of measurement. Then there are some behavioral types of measurements: facial expression, vocal tone, posture, those kinds of things. And then there are self-reported measurements, so pencil and paper questions or interviews, online tests, things like that. So there's different ways to get data related to happiness because there is no thermometer for happiness. There is no measuring tape for happiness. Happiness is vague. So there's not a perfect measurement, but there's a lot of imperfect, kind of next best sorts of measurements. And those fall into the categories that I just mentioned: physiological, behavioral, and self-report. Okay? This leads us to variables and operational definitions. So a variable is any quality or condition that can have different categories, levels, or values. So notice that the root of the word variable is vary. Variables vary. So for example, age is a variable. 23 is a score on that variable. Okay? Temperature is a variable. 75 degrees is a specific score on that variable. Gender identity is a variable. Female identity would be a specific score on that variable of gender identity, and so forth. Okay? Now, to be a variable, there need to be at least 2 categories or levels. But some variables are continuous, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? But variables vary. But variables can still be pretty vague. So for example, we've been talking about happiness level as a variable. But what does that mean? How is that measured? We just said there are lots of ways to measure it, and that is where operational definitions come in. An operational definition is how a variable is measured in a particular study. It is very specific. So when we said that you could measure happiness with physiological measures or behavioral measures or self-reported measures, that's narrowing down the measures, but that's still too vague. Then we said specifically facial expression, which is even more specific, but it's still not specific enough. So a true operational definition is going to be very, very specific and clear. So an example of an operational definition of happiness that is using a facial expression is something called the facial action coding system, or FACS. And that actually measures different movements in the face through the use of pictures or video clips, looking at how the face is moving and then using those measurements to actually score facial expression. So it's not just interpretation, it's not just opinion. It is based on a very clear set of rules for giving scores to the face. Okay? Likewise, for a self-report, saying something is a self-report narrows down what you're talking about, but it's still not specific enough. So, for example, the subjective happiness scale is actually a specific set of questions, and that would be an example of an operational definition of happiness level. So think specific. And people often overthink operational definitions. All it means is, how did you measure your variable in the study? What did you measure? Okay? Here's an example. Suppose you read a news headline that says, "Accuracy of memory improves with exercise." Upon reading the article, you discover that 50 participants jogged for 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week. 50 participants did not. They followed their regular routines. Then, all participants completed a laboratory task involving recall of words from a specific word list. Which of the following is an operational definition? Is it accuracy of memory? Or is it performance on a lab task involving recall of specific word lists? Okay? The operational definition is B, performance on a lab task involving recall of a specific word list. Accuracy of memory does narrow things down. That's the variable that's being measured, but how is that variable being measured? It's being measured through B. Okay? If you don't know the operational definitions that are used in a study, then you have no idea what the researchers did. Okay, last reflection. Suppose you're interested in studying the connection between happiness and money. Who might be relevant, interesting, or useful to study? Take a moment, press pause, reflect, and then when you're ready, press play. Okay, you might have had a lot of ideas. Perhaps you could study people with a lot of money, or people with very little money, or maybe you study a group of people and you spread them out in terms of different groups, high, medium, or low, in terms of income. Maybe you look at different gender identities or racial identities. But sometimes there are groups of people that are not relevant to most topics, but would be very relevant to a specific topic. And in this particular case, an example would be lottery winners. Lottery winners go to bed one night without a lot of money, and they literally wake up the next day and they have an enormous amount of money. Does it make them happy? And that has actually been studied, and the answer is yes, initially, but no, not in the long term. Okay, this leads us to populations and samples. A population is everyone in the group of interest for the research that you're doing. So for example, if you're studying 3-year-olds, then 3-year-olds is your population, all 3-year-olds. Okay? If you're studying women in Illinois, then women in Illinois is your population. So the population is big, it's broad, you're unlikely, except in certain circumstances, but you're typically unlikely to be able to test a whole population. There could be hundreds or thousands or even millions or billions of people in the population. If you're studying adults, then that's huge. So what you do is you study a sample. A sample includes the participants in the actual study. They have names, they have faces, and they are a subset of the population. So in this diagram here, the big blue circle is the population, the little blue circle is the sample. So you study the sample to learn about the population. And very often in psychology, as we'll talk about as we go forward, samples are not always as diverse as you might expect. So historically, it's been very common to have what are called weird samples. That refers to samples that are collected in nations that are predominantly white, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So the specific example you're especially likely to see in psychology are Introduction to Psychology undergraduate students who are completing studies to get course credit, okay? And then using their data to learn about people in general. There are always limits to a sample. No sample is perfect. So what's important is to know the general limitations. So for example, suppose you're interested in American teenagers, so you study 150 Harper students, all 18 or 19 years old. The population is American teenagers. The sample is 150 Harper students, and there's certain limitations you just need to be aware of. It's a perfectly fine sample, but Harper students are all somewhere in the Chicago region. In this case, we're talking about 18 and 19-year-olds, but teenagers actually includes 13 through 19. So this is sort of a narrow segment in terms of that age, and so forth. So last thing, I'm not going to show this video clip in this clip, but you can connect in the resources folder to All About Happiness. And when you're watching, watch for the study of moms in Texas. Who is the sample? How is happiness operationally defined? And what is flow? And then